quiet village, a priceless artifact, and a murder that could shake the snow-covered streets of Hartly Dene. Can Hercule Poirot uncover the truth? In the biting cold of winter, Hercule Poirot stood in his small rented room at the Black Swan Inn, a fireless, dim-lit space with walls that seemed to close in like a silent judgment. The snowstorm outside howled like a beast, battering against the ancient windows, while Poirot stamped his patent leather shoes on the wooden floor in a futile attempt to summon warmth. His gloved fingers rubbed against each other as his breath, visible in the chill air, left faint clouds that quickly dissipated. A knock at the door broke the icy silence. Poirot turned sharply, his gaze fixed on the entrance as though expecting an intruder rather than a simple chambermaid. The door creaked open, and a young woman stepped in, a thick-set country girl, her face round and flushed from the cold, with curiosity dancing in her wide eyes. She lingered at the door for a moment too long, taking in Poirot's meticulous appearance, the perfectly waxed mustache, the tailored coat, and, of course, the air of mystery that clung to him like a second skin. "Did you ring, sir?" she asked, her voice unhurried and coarse, though not unkind. "Yes," Poirot replied, his accent crisp, his tone polite but impatient. "The fire has not yet been lit. I find this cold quite unbearable." The girl nodded, though her hands moved slowly as she began gathering paper and sticks to kindle the fire. Poirot watched her every move, the rhythm of her work almost hypnotic. She seemed unbothered by the cold, unbothered by his scrutiny, a stark contrast to his own restless irritation. "Tell me," Poirot said suddenly, breaking the silence. "This village, Hartly Dene, is always so quiet in winter." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder with an expression that bordered on unease. "Aye, sir. Winters when this place sleeps. I suppose not much happens round here, not usually anyway." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with an implication Poirot couldn't ignore. He tilted his head, intrigued, but before he could press her further, she had already finished lighting the fire and scurried out, leaving him alone once more. Poirot settled into a chair near the now crackling flames, attempting to shake off the cold and his rising curiosity. Outside, the wind howled, and faint footsteps echoed through the hallways, ghostly in their cadence. He frowned. This place was alive with sounds that didn't belong, whispers of activity in a village meant to be dormant. An hour passed. Poirot reflected on his meal, a disappointing array of tough steak and watery vegetables, followed by a dessert so unremarkable that even his extraordinary mind struggled to recall its taste. Yet, as the fire's warmth seeped into his bones, he began to feel the first inklings of contentment. His eyes closed for a moment, savoring the stillness. Then came another knock, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the room like a blade. Poirot's eyes snapped open, his senses on high alert. "Entrees," he called. The chambermaid reappeared, her demeanor now more hurried than before. "Please, sir," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "The man from the garage is here. He says he needs to speak with you." Poirot's brow furrowed. The garage. He hadn't expected this so soon. "Let him come," he said simply, gesturing toward the door. She nodded and disappeared once more. Moments later, another knock came, this one slower, heavier, and full of hesitation. Poirot's fingers tightened around the arms of his chair as he called, "Enter." The door creaked open to reveal a young man, tall and broad-shouldered, with features so striking they seemed almost otherworldly. His blonde hair curled slightly at the edges, and his piercing blue eyes avoided Poirot's gaze as he twisted a worn cap nervously in his hands. There was something raw, something primal about him, like a figure pulled from the pages of mythology itself. Poirot's first thought was one of admiration. A Greek god, he mused silently. But as he studied the young man further, a flicker of doubt began to creep into his mind. The boy's movements were too rigid, his discomfort too pronounced. He stood there, shifting from foot to foot, as though the weight of the room pressed down on him. "About the car, sir," the young man began, his voice low and husky. "We've brought it in, found the trouble. Shouldn't take more than an hour to fix." Poirot nodded, his expression neutral. "And what precisely was the trouble?" The young man launched into a detailed explanation, his words tumbling over one another in an effort to sound professional. But Poirot wasn't listening. His sharp eyes were fixed on the boy's hands the way they gripped the cap too tightly, the faint tremor in his fingers. Something wasn't right. When the explanation ended, Poirot smiled faintly. "I see, you've done well. But tell me, why did you feel the need to come and inform me yourself? Surely my chauffeur could have relayed the message." The question hung in the air like a challenge. The young man hesitated, his face flushing red. I just thought I should, sir, to make sure you knew." "Ah, how conscientious of you," Poirot said smoothly, his tone polite but probing. "And yet there is something else, is there not?" The young man's face paled, and for a moment he looked as though he might bolt from the room. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You are not here about the car, are you?" The room seemed to shrink, the firelight casting long shadows across the walls. The young man's breath hitched, his fingers tightening on the cap until his knuckles turned white. I don't," he stammered, but Poirot cut him off. "Speak," Poirot commanded, his voice low and intense. "What is it that you cannot say? What is it that you fear?" The young man's lips parted, but no words came. The silence stretched unbearably, the tension so thick it felt as though the very air had frozen. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "There's something you need to see, but I can't explain it, not here." Poirot's heart quickened. "Then take me to it," he said, rising from his chair. The young man hesitated, his face a mask of conflict. Finally he nodded, stepping aside to let Poirot pass. As they left the room, Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that whatever awaited him would change everything. In the dim light of the hallway, he cast one last glance at the fire before the door closed behind them, plunging the room into darkness. Cliffhanger ending. The suspense is palpable. What has the young man discovered? Why is he so visibly shaken? And what lies ahead for Poirot in the cold, unforgiving night? Ted Williamson drew a deep breath, as though gathering courage to recount a memory that had never left him. "Well, you see, sir, it was like this. It all started last June. You know Grasslawn, don't you? The big estate by the river past the old stone bridge." Hercule Poirot shook his head. "I am unfamiliar." Ted nodded slightly, as though expecting this. "It's a grand place, belongs to Sir George Sanderfield. He only uses it in the summertime. Throws these big glamorous parties, you know, with all the high society types. Actresses, foreign guests, even a couple of big-shot politicians sometimes. Anyway, the wireless had broken down. They couldn't get the thing working, so they called me in to fix it." Poirot listened intently, his sharp eyes studying Ted's nervous hands, which twisted the tweed cap as though strangling the memory. "And so, you went?" "Yes, sir. I got there around noon. The whole place was quiet, too quiet. Sir George and his guests had gone out on the river, you see. Even the cook and the butler had joined them to serve drinks on the launch. It was a ghost of a house, huge, grand, but empty." Ted's voice softened as he leaned forward, eyes wide as though reliving the moment. "Except for her." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Her?" "A young lady, Nita. She said her name was. She was the only one there. Lady's maid to one of the guests, some Russian dancer. The moment she opened the door, I don't know how to explain it, sir. She wasn't like anyone I'd ever met before." "What was she like?" Poirot prompted gently. Ted paused, searching for the right words. "Small, delicate, but there was something sharp in her, you know. Her eyes, they weren't the sort of eyes you forget. Dark, almost black, but full of life. Mischief, even. Her accent was strange, too. French, I think. But her English was just fine. She had this air about her, like she was hiding something, or running from something. I couldn't explain it then, but now it all feels so strange." Poirot leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "Go on." "Well, she showed me to the wireless and stayed there while I worked on it. Normally, people just leave me to it, but not her. She watched, asked questions, laughed at my bad jokes. We talked. And the more we talked, the more I realized how different she was. She wasn't just a maid, sir. There was something else to her. Like she didn't belong there. Like she was playing a role in someone else's story. Ted hesitated, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what came over me, but before I knew it, I was asking her out, to the pictures that evening. She smiled, but said she couldn't. Her lady would need her, she said. But then she paused, thinking. She looked at me with those dark eyes, and out of nowhere she said she could get off early in the afternoon. Said they wouldn't be back from the river till late. So, we made a plan. I'd meet her by the old willow tree along the riverbank at 3 o'clock. He stopped, his hands gripping the cap tighter. Poirot's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. And did she come? Ted swallowed hard. She did. I didn't think she would. I mean, I wasn't much to look at. Just a local lad. But there she was, waiting under that willow tree, like something out of a dream. We walked along the riverbank, talking about everything and nothing. She told me she didn't like her job, said it wasn't what she'd signed up for. She wanted to leave, to start over somewhere new, but she was stuck. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I just thought she was unhappy, like anyone in a bad job. And then, Poirot's voice was barely above a whisper. Ted's face darkened. She looked over her shoulder constantly, like she was afraid someone might see us. At one point she grabbed my arm, and her fingers were ice cold. She whispered, "If anyone asks, you didn't see me. You never met me." I laughed it off. But she was dead serious. She even made a promise. "And you promised?" "Yes." But then, when I tried to ask her why she was so scared, she changed the subject. It was like she couldn't or wouldn't say. He hesitated, his voice trembling. "But here's the strange part, sir. When I wrote her a letter, weeks later it came back to me. 'Return to sender,' it said. And when I asked around about her, the dancer, the guests, even the staff, no one seemed to know who I was talking about. It was as if she'd vanished, like she was never there to begin with." The room fell silent. Poirot's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "And you never saw her again?" "No, sir, but I can't stop thinking about her. The way she spoke, the fear in her eyes. And now, with you here, I had to ask. Please, Mr. Poirot, who was she? And why does it feel like I'm missing something important?" Poirot's gaze pierced through Ted, his mind already working. He rose from his chair, pacing slowly. Then, without looking back, he asked, "This willow tree by the river, can you take me there?" Ted blinked. "Of course, sir, but why?" Poirot turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "Because, my friend, it seems that your young lady was not just hiding. She was running from something, or someone, and I fear that whatever she ran from may still be watching. A mystery of love and secrets." Ted Williamson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. His rough hands twisted together, betraying the nerves he tried to suppress. Poirot watched him closely, his sharp eyes glinting with curiosity and compassion. "And she was pretty, yes?" Poirot asked softly, breaking the silence. Ted's face softened, a wistful smile played on his lips, and his blue eyes took on a dreamy, faraway look. "She was just the loveliest thing you ever saw," Ted said, his voice carrying a tenderness that spoke of deep admiration. "Her hair was like gold, not just blonde, sir, but gold. It went up each side like wings, framing her face. And her walk," he trailed off, chuckling faintly. "She had this gay, light way of tripping along. I fell for her right away, sir. No use pretending otherwise." Poirot nodded, his gaze encouraging Ted to continue. Ted swallowed, his throat bobbing. "She said her lady, the Russian one, would be coming down again in a fortnight. We planned to meet. I was counting the days, sir, but—" His voice broke slightly, and he cleared his throat. "She never came, not a sign of her. I waited and waited at the spot, thinking maybe I got the time wrong, but nothing." The room seemed to grow quieter as Ted's story unfolded, drawing both Poirot and the listener deeper into his world. "At last, I made bold to go up to the house," Ted continued. Asked about her, I did. They said the Russian lady was still staying there with her maid, so they called for her. But when she came out, he paused, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. It wasn't Nita, sir, not at all. Just some dark, bold-looking girl. The sort you'd call catty. Marie, they said her name was. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And what did she say to you? Ted let out a bitter laugh. She simpered at me, sir, asked if I wanted to see her. I was so taken aback, I barely got the words out. I told her I was looking for Nita, the maid who'd been there before. She just laughed, said the last maid had been sent away suddenly. Sent away? I asked her. What for? She shrugged, like it was nothing, and said, How should I know? I wasn't here then. He stopped, his jaw tightening. Poirot leaned forward, his gaze intense but encouraging. And then, Poirot asked gently. Ted's voice dropped, the frustration evident. I didn't know what to say at the time, but later, I thought, maybe she'd know more. So, I found a way to talk to her again. Promised her a present if she could get me Nita's address. Marie was the sort who wouldn't do you a favor for nothing. And well, she got it for me. Someplace in North London. He shook his head. But when I wrote to Nita, the letter came back. No longer at this address, it said. Ted paused, staring hard at the floor. When he looked up, his eyes locked onto Poirot's with a desperate determination. You see how it is, sir, he said, his voice firm but tinged with vulnerability. It's not a case for the police, but I have to find her. I don't know how to go about it, but I thought maybe you could help. I've got a bit saved up. £5, maybe 10. I'd gladly pay. Poirot regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice calm and measured. We need not discuss money just yet. Instead, consider this. Nita knew your name, yes. She knew where you worked. Ted nodded. Yes, sir, she did. Then, Poirot said gently, if she wished to contact you, could she not have done so? Ted hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. I suppose so, but, his voice faltered. Poirot waited, his silence compelling Ted to speak. I know what you're thinking, Ted said finally, his voice quieter. You're saying I liked her, but she didn't feel the same way. Maybe that's true, but it wasn't just fun for her, sir. I know it wasn't. She liked me. She really did. Poirot tilted his head slightly, his piercing eyes narrowing. And yet, you suspect there is another reason she disappeared. Ted's face flushed a deep red. Yes, sir, he said, his voice firm again. I think she might be in trouble, mixed up in something bad. It was a funny crowd she worked for. She might have needed to disappear. Maybe. He hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. Maybe she was in the family way. Your child? Poirot asked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Ted's head shot up, his face burning with indignation. Not mine, sir. There wasn't nothing improper between us. I swear it. Poirot studied him, his expression softening slightly. And if she were in such a situation, would you still wish to find her? Ted's face darkened for a moment, before his expression transformed into one of steely resolve. Yes, I would. I'd marry her if she'd have me, no matter what. The room seemed to hold its breath. Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. Very well, Monsieur Williamson, Poirot said quietly. I will help you find her, but be warned, the truth is often not what we hope it to be. As Ted's grateful expression broke through, Poirot's mind was already racing, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. Somewhere, a clock chimed, its echo carrying an ominous weight. What secrets lay buried in Nita's disappearance, and would Ted be prepared for the truth when it finally surfaced? Cliffhanger ending. Poirot stood, his sharp mind working rapidly. Tell me, Monsieur Williamson, he said, did Nita ever mention something unusual? A name, a place, or perhaps something she was afraid of? Ted frowned, struggling to recall. Well, there was one thing, sir. She mentioned a man, someone her lady was afraid of. A name like Gregor or Grigorov. I didn't think much of it then. Poirot's eyes lit up, and for a brief moment, his expression turned grim. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting indeed. The scene ends as Poirot picks up his hat, a strange, dark glint in his eyes. Whatever lay ahead, it was certain to be more than a simple love story. The rain drummed steadily against the pavement as Hercule Poirot stood on the dimly lit doorstep of number 17 Upper Renfrew Lane. His sharp eyes took in the peeling paint on the door and the faint smell of dampness in the air. The stout woman who had opened the door stared back at him with suspicion, her bleary eyes narrowing as if gauging whether to trust him. Poirot, with his usual charm, inclined his head politely. "Good evening, madame," he began smoothly. "I believe you can help me. I am looking for a young woman who once lived here, Miss Villetta." The woman's lips tightened, her grip on the door tightening as if she might slam it shut at any moment. "Gone. Long time ago," she grunted, her tone curt. Poirot, unbothered by her lack of warmth, allowed a faint jingle of coins to sound from his pocket. The clinking noise seemed to catch her attention like a moth drawn to a flame. "Perhaps," Poirot said gently, "you might remember something that could help me. Even the smallest detail could be of great importance." The woman hesitated, her expression softening ever so slightly. "Left last summer," she did. "July, I think it was. Just up and left. Didn't say much." Poirot stepped forward, just enough to keep the door from closing. "And did she leave a forwarding address, madame?" The woman snorted. "Not likely. She was in a right state, left in a hurry. Back to Italy, I heard." "Ah, so she was Italian," Poirot murmured, more to himself than to her. "That's right. Had a temper on her, that one. Black eyes flashing, like she was ready to stab someone if they looked at her wrong." The woman gave a small, nervous laugh. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You believe she was angry when she left? Perhaps she had some trouble with her employer." The woman's demeanor shifted again, her hesitation now more obvious. "Well, there was talk, I suppose. Bit of a dust-up, they said, but Villetta didn't talk much about it. She kept to herself. And the Russian lady she worked for, Madame Samushin-Kash, was a dancer, no?" The woman brightened slightly, pleased to confirm something. "Oh yes, danced at the Thespian Theater. Everyone was mad about her. Fancy Russian name. Katrina something, or other. Real star she was." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, his mind weaving together the threads of information. And yet, despite her fame, Miss Villetta was dismissed. Curious, no? The woman shrugged. "Couldn't say why, but I'll tell you this, if there was trouble, it wouldn't surprise me. That girl was trouble herself, always had that look, like she was hiding something." Poirot pressed a half-crown into her hand. "Merci, madame. You have been most helpful." The woman's face lit up at the sight of the coin, and she clutched it tightly. "If I think of anything else, I'll let you know, sir." Poirot tipped his hat and stepped back into the rain, his mind buzzing with possibilities. Miss Villetta, a fiery-tempered Italian maid dismissed under mysterious circumstances. Madame Katrina Samashenka, a celebrated dancer at the Thespian Theater, entangled in some unknown drama. And somewhere in this web was the shadow of Sir George Sanderfield, a man with a reputation as dark as his secrets. Scene shift. The artist's studio. Poirot entered Ambrose Vandel's studio, a chaotic yet enchanting space filled with vivid sketches and half-finished sets. Ambrose himself, a wiry man with a flair for the dramatic, turned with a flourish as Poirot entered. "My dear Hercule, to what do I owe the honor? Come to admire my latest masterpiece." Poirot smiled indulgently. "Perhaps another time, my friend. Today I seek your knowledge. I am told you are acquainted with Sir George Sanderfield and a certain Madame Katrina Samashenka." Ambrose's face lit up. "Sanderfield. Oh, the dark horse, always up to something. That one. Rolling in money, but there's always whispers. You know, business deals that aren't exactly legal. And Katrina. Oh, Katrina. She was divine. Have you seen her perform the Swan of Tuonela? Absolute magic." "And their connection?" Poirot prompted. Ambrose's expression turned sly. "Ah, now there's a story. They were close, very close. Rumor had it she was the reason he kept showing up at the Thespian. But," he trailed off, his theatrical flair fading. "Yes?" Poirot leaned forward, his eyes intent. Ambrose hesitated, then lowered his voice. There was trouble. She broke it off. Something about her being scared. And not long after, there was that scandal, something about a maid disappearing from her household. Quite the gossip at the time. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A maid? Italian, perhaps? Ambrose nodded. "Yes, I believe so. Fiery little thing. Why? Is this all connected to one of your cases?" Poirot straightened, a gleam of determination in his eyes. "It is, mon ami, and I suspect the truth is far more dangerous than it seems." Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot left the studio, the rain had stopped, leaving the city slick with reflections of golden streetlights. He glanced again at the address Ted Williamson had given him and then at the intricate puzzle forming in his mind. Miss Valletta, Madame Katrina, Sir George Sanderfield, each a piece of a story that felt increasingly sinister. What was the connection between the fiery Italian maid and the celebrated dancer? And why did fear seem to ripple through every thread of this tale? Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a low, menacing voice behind him. "Monsieur Poirot, I suggest you stop asking questions." He turned sharply, but the street was empty. Only the echo of footsteps fading into the night remained. Poirot murmured to himself, his jaw tightening. So, the game begins. The mysterious Russian dancer and the maid. The room smelled faintly of expensive cigars and old leather, the heavy atmosphere matching Sir George Sanderfield's discomfort as he sat stiffly across from Hercule Poirot. His fingers drummed on the armrest of his chair, betraying a tension he couldn't quite conceal. "Well, Monsieur Poirot, what can I do for you?" he asked, his voice a mixture of politeness and impatience. "I confess, I'm quite curious." Poirot, ever composed, inclined his head slightly. "It is a mere matter of information," he said. Sir George chuckled nervously. "Ah, looking for inside dope, are you? Didn't know you were interested in finance." His laughter didn't reach his eyes. "It is not a matter of business, Sir George," Poirot replied smoothly. "It concerns a certain lady." At the mention of a woman, Sir George's demeanor shifted. He leaned back in his armchair, his unease momentarily replaced by a self-satisfied smile. "Ah, a lady. Well now, that's a different matter. And who might this lady be?" Poirot let the moment hang in the air before speaking. "You were acquainted, I think, with Mademoiselle Katrina Samoshenka." Sanderfield's laugh was quick and dismissive. "Oh yes, Katrina. A fascinating creature. Enchanting, really. Such a shame she's left London." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And why, may I ask, did she leave London so suddenly?" Sir George's smile faltered. He shifted in his seat, his discomfort returning. "My dear fellow, I wouldn't know. Something about a row with the management, I believe. She was temperamental, you know, very Russian in her moods. 1 minute laughing, the next in tears. Artistic types, eh?" He chuckled again. But this time it sounded forced. Poirot remained silent, his piercing eyes fixed on Sir George, who began to fidget under the weight of the detective's scrutiny. "I'm sorry, but I really can't help you there. I haven't kept in touch with her at all." As Sir George rose to signal the end of the conversation, Poirot spoke again, his voice calm but insistent. "But it is not Mademoiselle Samoshenka herself that I am interested in." The abrupt statement stopped Sir George in his tracks. "Oh, then who?" "It is a question of her maid." For the first time, Sir George looked genuinely startled. His face betrayed a flicker of alarm before he masked it with an awkward laugh. "Her maid? Good Lord. No, I can't say I remember her. Why on earth would you want to know about a maid?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "A maid can often see what others do not, Sir George. Perhaps you recall her now." The room grew still, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Sir George hesitated before replying, his tone suddenly defensive. "I seem to remember there was one. Marie something, wasn't it? A sneaky little thing, always poking her nose where it didn't belong. If I were you, I wouldn't put much faith in anything she says. Born liar, that one." Poirot's expression didn't change. He simply murmured, "So, You do remember quite a lot about her after all. The color drained from Sir George's face. Just an impression, he said hastily. I couldn't even tell you her full name. He forced a smile, but it was clear he wanted the conversation to end. Poirot let the silence linger before delivering his next question with precision. Do you recall the maid who worked for Mademoiselle Samoshenka before Marie Helen? Her name was Nita Valletta. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sir George froze, his discomfort now impossible to hide. Nita Valletta? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't remember her at all. Poirot's eyes glinted with suspicion. She was at your house, Grasslawn, last June. Surely you remember. Sanderfield's face darkened, and he spoke sharply. I don't believe Mademoiselle Samoshenka had a maid with her then. I think you're mistaken. But Poirot's expression told a different story. He didn't believe he was mistaken, and his silence spoke volumes. Scene shift. Marie Helen's statement. Marie Helen was a sharp-eyed woman with a face that gave away little, but Poirot's penetrating questions seemed to unnerve even her. She folded her hands primly in her lap, but her fingers twitched ever so slightly. I remember perfectly, monsieur, she said in smooth, measured tones. I was engaged by Madame Samoshenka the last week in June. Her former maid left in quite a hurry. Poirot leaned forward. And did you ever hear why this maid left so suddenly? Marie hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. Madame did not say. It might have been illness, something of that kind. And how did you find your mistress to work with? Marie shrugged, her expression carefully neutral. She was temperamental. She laughed. She wept. Sometimes she would not eat or speak for days. Other times, she was full of life, hosting grand parties. It is temperament, monsieur. These dancers, they are not like ordinary people. Poirot's voice was soft but probing. And Sir George, did you find him easy to work with? Marie's small, intelligent eyes darted toward Poirot and away again. Sir George, she repeated, feigning surprise. Oh, he was always kind to Madame. The detective caught the faint quiver in her voice, the flicker of fear in her eyes. He pressed on, his voice steady and unrelenting. Did you ever see or hear anything unusual during your time with Mademoiselle Samoshenka? Marie's composure cracked ever so slightly. She hesitated, then shook her head. Nothing, monsieur, nothing at all. Poirot studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. As he left, a single thought gnawed at him. Why was everyone so eager to forget Nita Valletta? Cliffhanger ending. The note. That evening, as Poirot sat alone in his study, his thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. A hotel porter handed him an envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message scrawled in hurried handwriting. Stop looking for Nita Valletta. She's gone, and so will you if you don't leave this alone. Poirot's eyes gleamed with determination as he folded the note. The game was afoot, and someone was desperate to keep the truth buried. The girl's gaze flickered up sharply, her eyes narrowing with a gleam that felt almost dangerous. Ah, Sir George Sanderfield, is it? She purred, her voice dropping a touch lower, the words laced with a challenge. You want to know about him, do you? Or perhaps it's something more. Or was that simply an excuse to ask? Poirot raised a brow, his patience thinning. It is not necessary, he interjected smoothly, cutting her off before she could spin her tale. For a moment, the girl's lips parted in shock, and a flicker of frustration crossed her features. You always know everything, don't you, Alexis Pavlovitch? She said, her voice dripping with a mix of admiration and irritation. Poirot's lips curled into a polite smile. But of course, he murmured in a tone that could almost be called flattering. Inside, however, his mind was racing, reflecting on how this third labor of Hercules had stretched across more countries and more interviews than he could have ever imagined. What began as a simple case of a missing lady's maid had turned into one of the longest, most convoluted mysteries he had ever faced. Every lead, every clue seemed to lead in circles, offering nothing but dead ends. And here he was, sitting at the Samovar restaurant in Paris, across from Count Alexis Pavlovich, who prided himself on being a connoisseur of the artistic world's deepest secrets. Pavlovich leaned back in his chair, a smug expression settling across his face. "Ah, yes. I know all, mon ami," he said, his tone full of self-importance. "You want to know about her. The little Samoshenka, the dancer with fire in her veins. She was the real thing, you know. A genius in her own right. But then she vanished without a trace. No one saw it coming. One minute, she's poised to take the world by storm. And the next, poof, gone, to be forgotten." Poirot's interest piqued, and he leaned forward. "Where is she now?" he asked, his voice tense with curiosity. Pavlovich's eyes glittered, but there was a tinge of sadness as he spoke. "In Switzerland," he said quietly, almost reverently. "Vagré les Alpes. It's where the lost souls go, where they fade away. Slowly, quietly. She will die there, you know. She's a fatalist, poor girl. She believes it's her fate." Poirot's throat tightened, but he didn't show it. He needed to focus. "And what of her maid, a woman by the name of Nita Valletta?" A flicker of recognition crossed Pavlovich's face. "Valletta. Ah, yes, I remember now. She was at the station once when I saw Katrina off to London. An Italian from Pisa, if I'm not mistaken. That's where she came from, I'm sure of it." Poirot sighed deeply, the weight of the investigation pressing on him. "In that case, it seems my next stop must be Pisa." A few days later, in Pisa, Poirot stood solemnly in the Campo Santo, looking down at a grave. This was it, the end of the road. Beneath the simple stone marker lay the girl who had captivated the heart of an English mechanic, her life snuffed out too soon. Was this the tragic end to a fleeting romance, a brief moment of passion forever frozen in time? Poirot couldn't help but wonder. The grief he'd witnessed in the Valletta family still lingered in his mind, the mother's tear-streaked face, the father's silent sorrow, the sister's dark, hard gaze. They had spoken of Bianca, the dancer who had been the light of their lives, only to be taken by a sudden illness. Appendicitis, they had said. A quick operation, an anesthetic, and then silence. The mother's voice had cracked as she added, "Bianca was always so clever. It's tragic, just tragic, for someone so young to be taken." Poirot murmured to himself. She died young. That was the message. The answer was clear, but somehow, something about it didn't sit right with him. Too neat, too perfect. He had one more journey to make. Vagré les Alpes. Vagré les Alpes. Poirot trudged through the cold, the sharp air biting at his face, as he reached the edge of the world. The snow-covered land stretched endlessly in every direction, each little cottage a tiny sanctuary for the sick, the dying, the forgotten. It was here that he found Katrina Samoshenka, her once vibrant beauty now drained, her face hollow, hands withered by the ravages of illness. She looked as though she had already one foot in the grave. But Poirot's mind was elsewhere. There was a sharp, distant recollection stirring within him. He had seen her dance, had been swept away by the artistry of it all. But now, standing over her weakened form, a sense of foreboding crept into his thoughts. Could this really be the end? Or was there something else, something hidden beneath the surface? The twists in this case seemed too deliberate, the strings too well tied. Poirot hesitated, a feeling growing in the back of his mind, one he couldn't ignore. He recalled Michael Novgin, the hunter, darting and twisting through that eerie, fantastic forest, the wild creation of Ambrose Vandel's mind. The golden hind, forever pursued, forever out of reach, a shimmering creature with horns and glinting bronze feet. He saw her collapse, shot and broken, and Novgin standing frozen, clutching the lifeless body of the deer. Katrina Samoshenka watched him intently, her gaze piercing. "Have we met before? What is it you seek from me?" Hercule Poirot bowed slightly, a rare glint in his eyes. "Madam, first, I must thank you for the beauty you once gave me. A night of grace, a dance that will never fade." She smiled faintly, but there was something guarded in her expression. "And now?" she asked. her voice cool yet intrigued. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "I come seeking the truth. A long time ago, I met a young woman in your service, a maid named Nita." "Nita." Her face stiffened, her eyes widened in shock. "What do you know about her?" Poirot's voice dropped. "Allow me to explain. One evening my car broke down, and a young man named Ted Williamson stood there, twisting his cap, stammering out his love and despair. He spoke of a maid, a woman who had disappeared, who he thought had vanished forever." Katrina's lips parted as she absorbed his words. "It's a tale of youth lost," she said, her voice distant, eyes clouded with memories. Poirot nodded, but his expression darkened. "Indeed. But there's more. I need to understand. What happened to her?" Her gaze faltered as she spoke slowly. "Juanita, yes, she was a maid, cheerful, carefree. Fate had its way with her, as it does with those who are blessed by the gods." Poirot paused, his tone deliberate. "She died young then?" "Yes," she whispered, almost to herself. "She died in Pisa after an operation." Poirot studied her closely. "And yet, there is something else that does not fit. Sir George Sanderfield, when I spoke to him, seemed afraid." "Why?" A brief flicker of disgust passed over her face. "You must have misunderstood. He thought you were speaking of Marie, the one who came after Juanita. Marie was troublesome. She tried to blackmail him over things she shouldn't have known. She was insufferable, always snooping into locked drawers, reading letters she shouldn't." Poirot absorbed this, his mind ticking. "Then the story begins to unravel," he murmured. "But there's still a detail that nags at me." Katrina's brow furrowed, a defensive air settling around her. "What do you mean?" Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Juanita's real name was Bianca. Yet she went by Juanita, a name she thought more romantic. How do you explain that?" Katrina's shoulders rose in a slight shrug. "Does it matter? Names are nothing. She preferred Juanita. What of it?" Poirot remained silent for a moment, then spoke with measured gravity. "For me there is another explanation." "What explanation?" she asked, the hint of a challenge in her voice. Poirot's gaze was steady, unwavering. "The young man Ted Williamson described had golden hair, wings of gold. When I heard that, it made me think of you, dancing on your bronze feet, like some golden deity in that strange, enchanted forest." She flinched slightly at the mention of the forest, her voice growing quieter. "The stricken deer." Poirot leaned closer, his voice now low and insistent. "Do you know what I think, mademoiselle? I think, for a brief moment, you were no longer a dancer, but a dream, a fantasy. A week when you had no maid, when Bianca had left, and you were alone. You had fallen ill, and on that day, while others were away on an excursion, a stranger came to your door. A young man, simple and handsome. You spun a story for him, a beautiful illusion. For a few hours, you lived in Arcady, didn't you?" Katrina stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then she exhaled deeply, her voice barely a whisper. "One part of your story, Poirot. Nita. She will die young." Poirot's eyes flashed with sudden intensity. "No." He struck the table with a sharp, forceful gesture. "It is not too late. You can fight for your life, mademoiselle. You can survive." Her face crumpled into sorrow. "And what life is there for me? What can I live for?" Poirot's tone softened, but his gaze was unwavering. "Not the life of a stage performer, certainly. But think, why not a different life? A quiet one. A life in a peaceful village. Children who dance like you once did. A simple life. A life worth living." She shook her head, disbelief flashing across her features. "It's absurd. Impossible." Poirot smiled, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "Impossible, you say? I believe it's just beginning." The Arcadian Deer wasn't just an artifact, it was a key to unlocking the truth. But in this village, truth comes at a cost. Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot's words lingered in the air, Katrina's breath caught. The door behind them creaked open, a shadow moved in the doorway, barely perceptible. A figure stepped into the room, the faintest glint of steel flashing in the dim light. Katrina's face paled. "Who is that?" she whispered. Poirot's gaze sharpened, was no longer the detective, but a man facing the unexpected. The figure stepped forward, a whisper escaping its lips. "You shouldn't have come here, mademoiselle." The Arcadian Deer wasn't just an artifact, it was a key to unlocking the truth. But in this village, truth comes at a cost.